You hired someone to renovate. They opened the wall. Now everybody is standing there looking at something nobody planned for. Chapter 1 was the warm-up. The newspaper and the patched pipes and the knob and tube. Those were the things that cost money and caused headaches. What comes next is the part contractors don't always bring up at the estimate. The first thing most people don't think about when they buy an old house is insulation. You think about the kitchen, the floors, the light in the afternoon. You think about the neighborhood and the commute and whether the basement smells like water has been somewhere it shouldn't. You think about the bones of the place, the ceilings, the original trim, the way the hardwood still holds up after decades of foot traffic. What you don't think about is what's packed inside the walls between you and the cold outside. And in a lot of older homes, built anywhere between the 1930s and the 1970s, the answer to that question is yesterday's newspaper. Not as a metaphor, as an actual deliberate building material. Crumpled paper, folded magazines, sometimes full-stack newspapers stuffed by hand into wall cavities as gap filler and thermal insulation. It was cheap, free in most cases. It was available in every house, and in the short term, it worked well enough that nobody complained. Builders used it. Homeowners added it during repairs. It was the kind of solution that made complete sense on a cold afternoon when you needed to seal a draft and the hardware store was closed. Open a wall in a house from that era today, and you might find a 1952 issue of a regional paper still legible inside the framing. Headlines intact, advertisements for things that no longer exist. For about 30 seconds, it's fascinating. Then you remember why you opened the wall. Dry paper in a wall cavity does not age well. It desiccates into something brittle and combustible over decades of heating and cooling cycles. It is not performing any meaningful thermal function at this point. What it is performing is the function of tinder, sitting inches away from electrical wiring that may itself be decades past its intended service life. The fire risk is the dramatic version of the problem. The slow version is moisture. Paper absorbs humidity and holds it against whatever surface it contacts. In a wall cavity, that surface is wood framing. Wet framing that stays wet, not from a visible leak, just from years of compressed damp paper resting against the stud, develops rot invisibly. The wall surface looks completely normal. The paint is fine, the baseboard trim is straight. You find out when you open the wall for an unrelated reason, and the framing you expected to find solid crumbles when you touch it. And then there are the rodents. Mice and rats experience wall cavities as climate-controlled, predator-free nesting environments, and they evaluate available materials accordingly. Compressed newspaper insulation is, from their perspective, exceptional, soft, workable, warm, and already conveniently in place. Contractors have opened walls to find multi-generational nesting ecosystems built entirely within the paper, shredded layers compressed into chambers, tunnels running between cavities, moisture damage radiating outward into the surrounding framing in a pattern that takes a moment to fully process. The wall looked perfectly normal from the outside. The problem had been building inside it for years. The insulation was free. The damage it caused was not. You'd think the wiring would be more obvious. You'd think something electrical and outdated would signal itself. A flicker, an intermittent outage, a smell near the panel. But if you're standing in a house built before 1950, the outlets look like outlets. The lights come on. The panel looks more or less normal, especially if someone swapped it out at some point without touching anything behind the walls. Nothing signals a problem. And inside those walls, there is a meaningful probability that you have knob and tube wiring still carrying live current to those perfectly ordinary-looking outlets. Knob and tube was the standard residential electrical system across North America for the first half of the 20th century. The name comes from the ceramic knobs used to route conductors along framing members and the ceramic tubes used where wires pass through joists and studs, a system designed to keep bare conductors separated from combustible materials. It was professionally installed, inspected by the relevant authorities, and signed off by everyone involved. For the loads it was designed to handle, a few circuits of lighting, perhaps a radio, perhaps an early refrigerator, it worked exactly as intended. The problem is that the world it was built for no longer exists, and the wiring does not know this. Knob and tube has no ground wire. This is not a minor shortcoming. The ground conductor in a modern electrical system provides a safe path for fault current. Without it, fault current goes somewhere else, and where it goes is not predictable in any useful way. Beyond the missing ground, the insulation on the conductors is rubber or cloth, both of which degrade in ways that modern thermoplastic insulation does not. In older installations, contractors find wire insulation so brittle after decades of heat cycling that it fractures and falls away from the conductor at the slightest disturbance, leaving bare copper exposed inside a cavity filled with aging wood and, occasionally, newspaper. The system was also never rated for what a modern household puts on it. A circuit installed to power a ceiling light and a floor lamp is now being asked to run a microwave, a coffee maker, a toaster, and several phone chargers. The wire handles this load until it doesn't. And across the decades between original installation and today, the system was extended and spliced by successive waves of homeowners and tradespeople who needed one more outlet, one more circuit, one more quick fix. Modifications now buried inside the wall, not in accessible junction boxes, not visible without opening the surface. Contractors doing straightforward renovations pull back the drywall and find it live. The project stops. Insurance companies have largely concluded that active knob and tube is either uninsurable or insurable only at rates that make the policy punishing. A full rewire runs from $15,000 to $40,000 depending on the house. It is not something you can defer once it's been found. The wiring worked perfectly for 1928. The house just never left 1928. Cast iron drain lines were a genuinely excellent product. Durable, quiet, chemically resistant, capable of lasting a very long time under normal conditions. The problem was never the cast iron itself. The problem was what happened when it began to fail and the person responsible decided a proper repair could wait until a more convenient moment. Cast iron corrodes from the inside. The process is slow, years, sometimes decades, but eventually the pipe walls thin, cracks develop at joints and along the barrel of the pipe, and the system begins to leak. A correct repair means opening the wall or floor, cutting out the compromised section, and replacing it properly. This costs money and requires scheduling and involves opening finished surfaces. A temporary repair means a rubber coupling, some self-fusing tape, perhaps a shot of expanding foam into a gap that looked serious. The temporary repair became permanent, not through any decision, but through inertia. Later arrived, looked at the patch, and decided it was holding. Later arrived again and added another layer of tape. Later never committed to the real fix because the real fix required commitment. Open the walls of a house where the plumbing was managed this way over multiple decades and you can read the entire history in layers. A rubber coupling from the early 80s now hardened and cracking itself. Tape layered over a fracture, then layered again when the first application started to fail. Expanding foam injected around a joint, now yellowed and brittle, providing nothing structural. In some cases, and experienced contractors describe these finds with the expression of someone who has stopped being surprised, pipe sections have been found wrapped in rags and bound with tape, holding back decades of drain flow through nothing more than compression and the absence of a better idea. The consequence is not just the smell that arrives before the visible damage does. It is black water infiltrating the floor cavity below the failed pipe. It is rot spreading through the subfloor and into the structural joists, silently, invisibly, until the floor develops a softness underfoot that you notice once and cannot stop noticing after that. By the time the floor tells you something is wrong, the repair involves a plumber, a carpenter, and a flooring contractor, all arriving at the same time with separate invoices. Somebody fixed it. Somebody just had a very flexible definition of fixed. The last reveal here doesn't come from the walls. It comes from the attic floor, and it looks genuinely like nothing. Small gray-brown pebbles poured loose across the joists, sometimes several inches deep, settling into every gap and sitting undisturbed. Lightweight, easy to install, sold widely through hardware retailers from the late 1970s into the 1980s under brand names that suggested responsible home improvement. Vermiculite insulation. Pour it yourself on a Saturday morning, level it off, close the hatch, decent thermal performance, no contractor required, immediate satisfaction of having done something useful for your energy bills. A significant portion of the vermiculite sold commercially across North America during that period came from a mine in Libby, Montana, one of the largest vermiculite producers in the world. The Libby mine was later found through health investigations and epidemiological studies to contain naturally occurring tremolite asbestos contamination throughout the ore body. Tremolite is among the more hazardous asbestos fiber types in terms of documented health outcomes. The contamination was not a trace presence. It was pervasive enough that workers at the mine and residents of the surrounding community experienced elevated rates of asbestos-related disease at levels that eventually drew federal intervention and long-term remediation efforts. The pebbles on your attic floor carry none of this history visibly. They look exactly like what they were sold as: harmless, inert, lightweight fill. They will continue looking that way as long as nobody disturbs them. The risk is not from the material sitting quietly under additional insulation added years later. The risk is from every ordinary reason someone enters an attic: adding insulation, running a new wire for a ceiling fixture, installing a ventilation fan, investigating a roof leak, storing boxes, checking on a sound that started last winter. In every one of those scenarios, a person moves through a space containing a material that may release asbestos fibers when disturbed, in a confined environment with limited air exchange, without respiratory protection, because they had no reason to think protection was necessary. Removal requires licensed hazmat contractors and regulated disposal. The cost is frequently several $1,000s and often more. Many homeowners are never told the material is present because it sits out of sight, looks like nothing, and falls outside the scope of a standard home inspection unless testing is specifically requested. It is sitting right now in attic floors across North America, in homes that have changed hands multiple times since the 1980s, with current owners who have no knowledge of what it contains or what happens when they go up there to retrieve the holiday decorations. It looks like gravel. It was sold like gravel. It was not just gravel. Fire investigators and fire marshal reports have consistently identified aluminum branch circuit wiring as a contributing factor in residential fires. The wiring does not fail spectacularly. It fails quietly behind a switch plate, inside a wall box, in the space between the outlet and the stud, in the place you have no reason to look. Contractors opening outlet boxes during renovations in homes from this era find it regularly. Sometimes they find it connected to devices that are only rated for copper, a mismatch that increases the risk further. Remediation means either rewiring the affected circuits entirely or installing approved copalum crimp connectors or antioxidant compound at every single device in the house. Neither option is fast, and neither is cheap. Copper was expensive. The fix for aluminum was more expensive. The fire was the most expensive of all. During the energy crisis of the 1970s, home insulation became a priority. Fuel costs were rising, and older homes were leaking heat through every wall cavity. A new product arrived to solve exactly this problem, and it was genuinely clever in concept. Urea formaldehyde foam insulation, UFFI, could be injected directly into existing wall cavities through small holes drilled in the exterior. No demolition, no drywall removal, no major disruption. You drilled the holes, the foam was pumped in, the holes were patched, and your walls were insulated. In some markets, it was government incentivized as an energy efficiency measure. Contractors were selling it. Homeowners were buying it. It seemed like exactly the kind of solution the moment required. The foam had a different interpretation of the situation. As urea formaldehyde cures, and then again as it ages, particularly in humid conditions, it releases formaldehyde gas. Residents in homes where UFFI had been installed began reporting headaches, nausea, eye irritation, and respiratory problems. The pattern was documented enough to prompt regulatory action. Canada banned UFFI for residential use in 1980. The U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission attempted a ban in 1982. That ban was later overturned on procedural grounds, but the damage to the product's reputation was permanent, and it disappeared from the market. The foam itself, however, did not disappear from the walls. UFFI also shrinks and cracks as it ages, which means that in most cases, it no longer provides meaningful insulation. It occupies the wall cavity, off-gassing into the home, providing no thermal benefit, impossible to remove without opening every wall it was injected into. Contractors drilling into walls for unrelated work in 1970s, homes still encounter it. The chemical smell is recognizable. The material is still present. The government program that incentivized its installation is long gone. They injected the solution into the walls. 20 years later, contractors were drilling into the walls to find it. The solution had become the evidence. The last one is not a single product. That's what makes it the hardest to close a wall on and walk away from. Asbestos was not installed in old homes as one material. It was added to dozens of products simultaneously, each for a legitimate functional reason, across several decades of residential construction. The textured finish on your popcorn ceiling contained it because asbestos added durability and fire resistance. The black mastic adhesive holding down vinyl floor tiles contained it because it improved adhesion and longevity. Joint compound used to finish drywall seams contained it. Pipe insulation wrap contained it. Some attic insulation contained it. Roof shingles, exterior siding, ceiling tiles. The list is long, and it covers the ordinary surfaces of ordinary homes built before roughly 1980. None of this was hidden at the time. It was standard practice. The materials were sold openly, installed by licensed contractors, permitted, and inspected. You walk into an older home and the surfaces look fine. The ceiling is painted, the floor is covered, the walls are smooth. Nothing signals danger because the materials are stable when they are left alone. Asbestos-containing materials that are intact and undisturbed do not release fibers in quantities that create immediate risk. The guidance from health and building authorities is consistent. If it is in good condition and not being disturbed, leave it. The problem is that the reason you opened the wall was because you needed to do something. A bathroom renovation in a pre-1980 home can come to a complete legal halt in the middle of a project you budgeted carefully and scheduled months in advance. You hired a contractor. You picked the tile. You agreed on a timeline. The demolition started on a Monday morning, and by Tuesday afternoon, everyone is standing still because the testing came back and there is asbestos in the adhesive beneath the floor tiles, in the texture coating on the ceiling, and in the joint compound on every wall in the room. 3 separate materials, 3 separate abatement requirements, 1 bathroom. The contractor you hired for the renovation is not qualified to touch any of it. That work requires a licensed abatement professional operating under specific regulatory protocols, containment barriers, negative air pressure, personal protective equipment, documented disposal through approved channels. You are not choosing between doing it and not doing it. You are choosing between doing it correctly and doing it in a way that creates legal and health consequences you do not want. So you make the calls. You wait for the abatement contractor's availability, which is not the same as your renovation contractor's availability. You pay for the initial testing, which you should have done before demolition started but didn't because the scope of the project seemed straightforward and the house looked fine. You pay for the abatement itself, which is priced by the volume of material, the difficulty of access, and the disposal requirements in your jurisdiction. You pay for the post-abatement clearance testing, which confirms the space is safe before the renovation contractor is allowed back in. Then you pay for the original renovation to resume, now running on a timeline that has shifted by weeks and a budget that has expanded by an amount that is difficult to absorb in the middle of a project already underway. Homeowners who did not test before opening the wall are in a more difficult position than those who did. The material has already been disturbed. Fibers have potentially already been released into the living environment of the home. The conversation about abatement is now happening after the fact, in a room that has been partially demolished, with dust that has already settled on surfaces throughout the house, and with a renovation contractor who has stopped work and is waiting for instructions. The options available at this stage are more constrained, more expensive, and more stressful than they would have been if the testing had happened first. The testing, for context, costs a few $100s. It is the least expensive part of every scenario in which asbestos is present. The deeper frustration, the part that is genuinely difficult to sit with once you understand it, is that none of this is the result of negligence or concealment by the people who built the house. The materials were installed openly by licensed professionals under permit, with inspections, using products that were sold through legitimate commercial channels and met every applicable standard at the time of installation. The joint compound was not a cheap shortcut. The floor tile adhesive was not a workaround. The ceiling texture was not a mistake anyone recognized as a mistake. These were standard materials used in standard ways in standard homes across the country for several decades. The people who installed them were doing their jobs correctly by every measure available to them at the time. The materials remain legally in place in occupied homes across North America today. No regulation requires a homeowner to remove intact, undisturbed asbestos-containing materials from a private residence. This is a defensible policy. The cost of mandating universal abatement across the existing housing stock would be staggering, financially, logistically, and in terms of the disruption to occupied homes. Leaving stable materials in place and managing them through informed maintenance and pre-renovation testing is a reasonable approach to an impossible problem at scale. It is also a policy that means a very large number of currently occupied homes contain asbestos in their ceilings, their floors, their walls, and their mechanical systems. In kitchens where families prepare meals, in bathrooms used every morning, in the bedrooms where children have slept for years without anyone in the house knowing what is in the texture on the ceiling above them. The material is stable. The material is not releasing fibers at levels that constitute an acute daily risk. The material is also present, confirmed, and waiting for the moment when somebody decides to do something to the room it's in. The rule is, leave it alone and it will not hurt you. The problem is that the reason you opened the wall was because you needed to do something. Every material here was installed by a licensed professional, approved by a code body, or recommended by a government program. Most of it passed inspection. Most of it came with a warranty. Nobody was cutting corners in any way they recognized. Nobody expected their decision to become someone else's expensive problem 40 years later. The people who bought those houses signed the documents, moved in the furniture, made dinner, and assumed the hard part was ordinary maintenance. Not a project that stops mid-demolition because the walls require a different kind of professional entirely. The wall closed, the inspection passed, the family moved in. Decades later, somebody opened the wall again. Your house is not a monument to how it was built. It is a record of every decision made inside it, the confident ones, the economical ones, the ones made on a cold afternoon when a temporary fix seemed reasonable and later never arrived. The building codes we use today exist largely because someone, at an earlier point, found out the hard way what happens when the standards haven't caught up yet. Homes are not finished when construction ends. They are corrected, slowly, expensively, one opened wall at a time. The house passed inspection. The house always passes inspection. That is not the same as being finished. If your walls could talk, you'd want to be subscribed. Hit the button. This channel is just getting started.